Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Utility mapping is one of those jobs that sounds straightforward until you do it for a while, and then it reveals itself as something considerably more complicated than the job description suggests. The basic premise is simple enough. Take specialized equipment into the field, locate buried infrastructure, record its position and depth, hand the data to the engineers who need it. Gas lines, water mains, electrical conduit, communications cable, the invisible network that runs underneath every developed landscape and that nobody thinks about until something goes wrong with it. The complication is that nobody has ever mapped all of it, not even close. Infrastructure gets buried and the paperwork gets lost or was never completed or references a coordinate system that nobody uses anymore. And over time, the gap between what's documented and what's actually in the ground grows wide enough that you can spend a full week in a single county finding things that no record anywhere acknowledges. Rural counties are the worst for this. Decades of utility work done by local contractors with varying standards of documentation. Municipal records that burned or flooded or were simply never kept with any rigor, and underneath all of it, a physical reality that you can only access by getting out there with equipment and listening to the ground. I had been doing it for 5 years by the time I got to Carroll County, Kentucky, which is in the eastern part of the state where the terrain gets complicated fast, ridge after ridge of forested hill country, with a network of small communities in the valleys between them. The county had never had a comprehensive utility survey, and the project was a full county documentation effort commissioned by the state, the kind of contract that takes months and generates enough data to keep engineers busy for years afterward. My equipment was ground-penetrating radar for shallow features and an electromagnetic line tracer for anything carrying current or generating a field, supplemented by a signal analyzer that I used to characterize anomalies before logging them. I knew that equipment the way you know any tool you use daily for years, knew its normal outputs and its quirks, and the particular way it expressed different types of findings. When it showed me something outside its normal operating range, I recognized it the same way you recognize a word mispronounced by someone who usually speaks clearly. The anomalous signal showed up in week 3. It was faint at first, an intermittent reading on the signal analyzer that appeared when I was working a section of the county's northern area and disappeared when I moved away from it. The analyzer classified it as interference, which was the default classification for anything that didn't match its library of known utility signatures, and I logged it as such and moved on. But it came back the following day in a slightly different location, and the day after that in a third location, always in the northern part of the county, always faint, always vanishing when I moved the equipment more than about 200 meters from wherever I detected it. The pattern of appearances was what made me start logging it separately from the routine interference flags. Interference from external sources doesn't move. Radio frequency noise from a power line or a communications relay sits where the source is and doesn't migrate across the landscape between survey sessions. What I was detecting was appearing in different locations on different days in a way that suggested either multiple sources or a single source with some kind of directionality, a signal that I was catching the edge of from varying angles rather than sitting in the middle of. I mentioned it to Marsh on the 4th week. Marsh was the other field technician on the county project, working the southern sections while I handled the north. We shared a company truck and a motel room in the county seat and ate dinner together most evenings, which over the course of a long project creates the particular kind of easy familiarity that doesn't require much maintenance. He was methodical and technically precise and had a skepticism about anomalies that I respected because it came from experience rather than in curiosity. He'd been doing this work for 8 years and had seen enough equipment-generated artifacts to know that most interesting readings had boring explanations. He listened to my description of the signal over dinner and asked the right questions, the ones I'd already asked myself, about source characterization and geographic distribution and the consistency of the readings across sessions. When I showed him the log, he was quiet for a while in the way that meant he was taking it seriously. He said he'd seen something in his southern sections that might be related, a faint periodic reading on his line tracer that didn't correspond to any documented infrastructure, appearing along a roughly north-south band in his working area. He'd logged it as probable interference from a utility corridor in the neighboring county and moved on. But looking at my northern detections plotted against his southern ones, the distribution suggested both of us were detecting the same thing from opposite ends, something running north to south through the county, underground, generating a signal that our equipment was sensitive enough to catch at the margins. We started tracking it after hours, which was outside the project scope and technically in a grey area regarding equipment use. And we both understood that and did it anyway, because the alternative was walking away from something neither of us had a satisfying explanation for. We'd drive out to the Northern Ridge sections after the workday ended, while there was still enough light to work, and run systematic passes with the signal analyzer, trying to get a cleaner fix on the source location. The signal got stronger as we moved west. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious without the systematic tracking, but consistently and reproducibly, the readings incrementally stronger in the western portions of the ridge sections than in the eastern ones. Over 2 weeks of after-hours work, we narrowed the strongest detections to a specific area of the county, an unpopulated ridge about 12 miles northwest of the county seat that had no documented utility infrastructure and no visible surface features that would explain any subsurface installation. No access roads, no utility poles, no junction boxes, nothing that the surface normally produces above a buried utility feature of any significance. The ridge was forested, second growth from the look of it, unremarkable terrain that blended into the surrounding hill country without distinction. We parked at the nearest point where the county road came close to the ridge and hiked in about a mile to where the signal analysis was putting the strongest readings. Marsh said on the walk-in that the signal had a quality he'd been trying to put words to for the past week. He said it felt periodic in a way that utility signals weren't usually periodic. Utility signals were continuous, or they were keyed to load cycles, or they followed the rhythm of the infrastructure they were associated with, all of which had mechanical explanations. He said the periodicity he was seeing was different. It had an interval that he kept wanting to describe as regular, the way a clock was regular, except that clocks were mechanical and the interval he was seeing had slight variations that mechanical systems didn't produce. Slight variations that biological systems did. He said he might be reaching. I said I didn't think he was reaching and told him I'd been thinking the same thing for 3 days and hadn't said it because it sounded like the kind of thing you didn't say out loud on a utility survey. We reached the area of strongest signal around 6 in the evening, with about 90 minutes of usable light. The ground-penetrating radar, which wasn't designed for the depth we were interested in, but which I ran anyway on the chance it would show something, produced a return at about 40 feet down that it classified as a void, a space where there was no material for the signal to bounce back from. The void reading was larger than the equipment's reliable range could fully characterize, but the returns I was getting suggested a horizontal extent of at least 30 feet, possibly more, and a regularity to its boundaries that natural voids didn't typically have. Natural voids are irregular. Sinkholes, solution caves, weathered fractures in bedrock, all of them express the randomness of geological process. The return I was getting had edges that the radar was reading as consistent, which meant either the equipment was misreading the geology or there was something down there with deliberate geometry. Marsh had found the fissure while I was running the radar. It was about 8 inches wide and ran about 3 feet along the surface rock before narrowing to nothing, a natural crack in the ridge bedrock that had probably been there for a long time. The signal analyzer sitting next to it was running stronger than I'd recorded anywhere in the county. The kind of reading that would have flagged a mandatory review flag if it had appeared in routine survey data. He had a probe camera in his equipment bag, a flexible cable unit we used for inspecting conduit interiors, not designed for open fissures, but usable in one wide enough to accept the camera head. He looked at me, and I looked at the fissure, and we both understood we were going to send the camera down. He fed the cable in slowly. The camera head had its own light source and transmitted to a handheld display, and we watched the feed as it descended. Rock walls close on either side, the fissure narrowing and then opening slightly as the cable found the path of least resistance downward. At about 20 feet, the rock walls fell away on the display as the camera entered a larger space. The void, the camera light, didn't reach the far walls. Whatever the extent of the space was, it was beyond the camera's illumination range, which meant it was larger than we'd estimated from the surface readings. The floor was visible, bare rock, and the ceiling was visible, and both of them had a quality I noticed before I could articulate why I was noticing it. They were smooth, not water-worn smooth, not the gradual smoothing of dissolution or erosion. Smooth in the way surfaces are smooth when something has moved against them repeatedly over a long period of time. The ceiling especially, which should have had the irregular profile of fractured bedrock, had a consistent arc that looked like it had been worn that way. The signal analyzer was registering the strongest reading I'd seen from the beginning of the project, and it was pulsing with the periodicity that Marsh had described on the walk-in, the biological interval, the rhythm with slight variations that mechanical systems don't produce. The camera reached the depth of the floor and Marsh panned it slowly, taking in the visible portion of the void interior. In the far edge of the camera light, at the limit of what the illumination could reach, there was a texture on the floor that was different from the bare rock surrounding it. I asked Marsh to hold the display steady, and I looked at it for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was dark, and the resolution at that distance wasn't good, and what I was looking at was at the edge of the camera's range, but it had a quality that the surrounding rock didn't have. It moved, not dramatically, a slow, subtle movement, the kind that you second guess because it's at the limit of what you can resolve, and your eyes want to explain it as camera shake or compression artifact. But I watched it for 30 seconds, and the movement was real. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction at the far edge of the light. The signal spiked. The analyzer went from its highest previous reading to a value that took it to the end of its display range in approximately 2 seconds. And at the same moment, the probe cable went rigid in Marsh's hands. Not slack, not loose, rigid, pulled taut from below with a sustained downward force that he felt through his hands before he registered what was happening, and the cable ran another foot into the fissure before he braced himself against the rock and held it. He held it for about 4 seconds and then looked at me, and I already had the cable cutter from my equipment bag, and I cut the cable, and the tension released so fast that Marsh sat down hard on the ridge rock. The signal stopped. Not faded, stopped. The way it had never stopped in all the weeks that we'd been tracking it, always present at some level, even at the margins of detection. The analyzer showed nothing. The baseline noise floor of the equipment, the electromagnetic hum of the world that was always there, and nothing above it. We walked back to the truck without talking and drove to the motel, and I think we both understood, without discussing it, that the after-hours tracking was finished. I filed the void detection in the survey data as a probable equipment artifact, noted the location, and flagged it as requiring no follow-up. Marsh filed similarly for the signal readings from his southern sections. Nobody reviewed either filing with any particular attention. The project continued for another 6 weeks and was completed without further incident, and I went on to the next county contract and tried to put the ridge in the category of things that had explanations I hadn't found yet. Marsh transferred to the company's Western Regional Office about 2 weeks after we finished the Carroll County project. He sent me a message the day he transferred that said he was looking forward to working somewhere with no hills, which I understood completely, and I haven't spoken to him since. A year later, I was back in Carroll County on a follow-up survey, a standard documentation update for a section of the county that was getting new infrastructure. The work took me back into the Northern Ridge area for 3 days. On the first morning, running my standard equipment setup to establish the day's baseline, the signal analyzer showed an anomalous reading in the northern section. I recognized it immediately. The interval, the slight biological variations in the periodicity, the way it strengthened as I moved west, all of it exactly as it had been the year before, except for one difference. It was stronger, not marginally stronger, not the kind of increase that sits within measurement variance. Substantially stronger, the kind of increase that meant either the source had grown or it had moved closer to the surface. I logged it as interference and filed it as requiring no follow-up and finished the 3-day survey without going anywhere near the ridge. But I know what the reading means. I've been doing this work long enough to know the difference between equipment artifact and a genuine detection, and I know that whatever went quiet when I cut that cable a year ago has started up again, and that the increased strength means it's either larger or closer than it was, and I don't know which of those options I find less comfortable. I know it was aware of the camera. I know the signal spiked when the camera reached depth, which means something down there registered the camera's presence at 40 feet underground, which means it has a sensitivity to the surface environment that it has apparently been using for a long time to avoid detection. It knew we were there before we knew where it was. It let us track it for weeks. It let us lower a camera into its space and illuminate part of what it was, and then it pulled the camera toward it and let us cut the cable and went quiet. And now it's running again, stronger than before, in the same location, on the same interval. Whatever it was doing down there in the dark, under that Kentucky ridge, under 40 feet of solid rock, in a void with walls worn smooth by long contact, it wasn't finished. It was just waiting for someone to come back and notice.